Next week, we're going to be practicing changing numbers from fractions to decimals, into percents, and back and forth. Page 20 in your interactive binder is your purple page that you glued in. All of the notes are in there that are going to help you be able to solve some of these problems. So you're going to open the flap. Depending on if you want to go from fractions to percents, you're going to open this flap right here. If you pull out your interactive binders, you can see that. Fractions to decimals, you'll pull out this one. Percents to fractions here, percents to decimals, and so forth. So all of these directions are here. They are going to be really, really useful to you. Some other things we want to point out, these numbers can be multiplied together to make 100. 100 is a really important number because that's what percents are out of. Percents are out of 100%. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about the math alphabet. When we sing the math alphabet, it goes A, B, C, D, E, F to P. We skip some letters in between. We don't care about them. D represents decimals. P represents percents, and we'll get to that in a minute. The other words that are important to know is goes on the top, of goes on the bottom, my part and my whole. We're going to talk a little about ratios and proportions when we talk about percents. So I can always write a percent out of 100 because that's the best I can get. The worksheet that I gave some of you do not have, looks like this. So if I have a percent and I want to change it to a decimal, I can sing my alphabet song. I can sing A, B, C, D, E, F to P. And when I do that, I'm going from a percent to a decimal. Okay. When I go from a percent to a decimal, I move to the left 2 places. So if I were to put a decimal in here, I shift the decimal 2 places to the left, and it is now 1800ths. If I take this one, shift 2 places to the left, it's now 2800ths. Here's another way I can think about it. Percents are out of 100. So if I look at my interactive binder and I go to the percent to a fraction, the directions say that you write it as a fraction by the percent is the numerator, the denominator is 100, and then simplify. So again, percents are out of 100. And 18% is like I got an 18 out of 100, which then I can divide by 2 and simplify to 9 over 50. 28% would be 28 out of 100. I can divide both of those by 4, and I get 7 over 25. Now you'll also notice here that when I go from a percent to a fraction, I write it over 100, and I read this as 18 out of 100, or 1800ths. Don't I read this number? 1800ths, 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 1800ths. I can read those fractions and rewrite them just as a decimal, as another way of doing it. So when I go from fractions to decimals, I make it out of a tenth or a hundredth, and it's really easy to do that. Okay? If I move down some, and I now have fractions, and I want to take my fraction and I change it into a percent. If I look in my interactive binder, when I change a fraction to a percent, it says divide the numerator by the denominator and multiply by 100. This is what we do when we find our percentages when I give you your test back. Now, some of these are going to be really easy. They actually match up with those multiplication problems I put on page 20. So remember, we wrote on there that 2 times 50 and 4 times 25 and 5 times 20 and 10 times 10, they all equal 100. So what I can do, because percents are out of 100, is I can make this a fraction out of 100. How many 10s make 100? Well, if I come over here and look, it's 10. So if I multiply by 10, 3 times 10 is 30. I can change this one into a fraction out of 100. 20, I multiply by 20. If I look over here, see it? So I can multiply by 20 and get 40 hundredths. Okay? So I can change any number that has a denominator of 250, 425, 520, or 10. I can change them to a fraction out of 100, And then I can very easily rewrite this as 30% because it's 30 out of 100. This would be 40% because it's 40 out of 100. Now, if it's not something as easy as that, say it's something like 3 out of 8, I can still do that. I would take 3 divided by 8 in my calculator. My calculator tells me it's 0.375. Okay, and if I didn't have a calculator, we know how to divide fractions now. Okay, and get a decimal. So anyway, back to this. If I take 3 divided by 8, here's the decimal I get. I move the decimal 2 places to the right to go from a decimal to a percent. Okay, so that would give me 37 5/10%. Okay, so that's another way I can solve those problems. That's probably one of the trickier ones. When my denominator is one of these, it's pretty easy. When my denominator is not one of these numbers, I divide to make a decimal. And then remember my song up here? A, B, C, D, E, F to P. To go from a decimal to a percent, I move 2 places to the right. All right? Okay, let's talk about changing fractions to decimals. That's pretty easy. In order to change a fraction to a decimal, I take the numerator divided by the denominator. So I take 3 divided by 10. It gives me 3/10 or 30/100. Okay. Now, in this problem, because this one here, and that looks like to be the only one, if it's a denominator of 10 or 100, I can just say it out loud, kind of like I did up here. 1800s is 1800s, right? 2800s is 2800s. Otherwise, I do some division. 2 divided by 5 gives me an answer of 4/10. 1 divided by 4 gives me an answer 25/100. Okay, then let's go down to the bottom part. If I have decimals and I want to change my decimal into a fraction, this is pretty easy, ladies and gents. All we do is I read this number, 3500s, 3500s, 7500s, 7500s. When I have a decimal and I change it to a fraction, I simply read it out loud and I rewrite it. Now, I do have to do some simplifying. These both end in a 5 or a 0, so I can divide by 5. I get 7/20. This problem here, my GCF is actually 25, so I can divide by 25 and get 3/4. Okay. And to change a decimal to a percent, this is where I sang my song just a minute ago. This is what my directions say in my interactive binder. A, B, C, D, E, F to P. When I go from a decimal to a percent, I'm moving to the right 2 places. So all I do is I take my decimal, 1, 2 places, 35%. 1, 2 places, 75%. I can do that for a number such as this. If I move the decimal 1, 2 places to the right, that's actually a percent larger than 100. It would be 115%. What I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to stop and pause. I'd like you to work on the rest, fill in your worksheet if you haven't already done so from the video, and you take a moment, a couple minutes, and fill in the rest of the worksheet, and then send me a picture either in Google Classroom or via email. Now that you had a chance to look over all of those and practice some of those, we're going to go to our journal. If you look at your math message, it says, for each pair of statements, circle the statement that is most commonly used. So if I'm talking about making a recipe, do I use 50% of a cup or do I use 1/2 of a cup? Well, if you've ever done any baking or cooking, you realize we use fractions for that one. Do I talk about 25% off the regular price, or do I talk about 25/100 off the regular price if I was out shopping? We use percentages for this one. The toy cost 75 cents in decimals. Or the toy costs 75% of a dollar. Well, that sounds really goofy, right? We use decimals. And finally, for the last one, there is a 10/100ths chance of rain, or there's a 10% chance of rain. We use percentages. So the point of that, ladies and gentlemen, was to see that we use different numbers in different situations. Percent sometimes makes sense, sometimes decimals do, sometimes fractions do. We certainly can convert back and forth between them. They all mean the same thing, but they're representative and they kind of make our brains think differently. All right, a recent survey investigated how distracted people are when they cross the street. Here are the results. Okay. Oops, and I hope you were able to see that. I know sometimes it gets things cut off, so hopefully you were able to see that. But let me scroll here. So I'm going to do the first one together. You're going to work on the rest on your own and then send me a picture. So this is kind of concerning. 51% of people talk on the phone while crossing the street. 34% listen to music, and 26% aren't paying any attention at all. They're texting or emailing. Great, that's fantastic. All right, and if the driver that is driving the car while you're walking across the street is doing the same thing, that's a recipe for disaster. Pay attention, folks. 51% we talk on the phone. How do I write that as a decimal? Oh, we can do that. We can go from a percent to a decimal by singing my song, A, B, C, D, E, F, to P. So to go from a percent to a decimal, I move 2 places to the right. 0.51. How do I write it as a fraction? Well, percents are out of 100, so it's 51 out of 100. This is a 10 by 10 grid, which means that there are 100 little blocks there. So in order to show 51%, I need to do 5 groups of 10, which is my 50. And then I need one more little block. There it is. So 51% is just over half. You're going to pause the video and pause anytime you need to moving forward. You're going to pause. You're going to work on journal page 134 and finish that. Excuse me, not 134, 136. Make sure you pause because in a minute, if you keep going, you'll be able to see the answers. Okay, hopefully you had some time to work on that because here are the answers to that page. Let's move on to the next page. We're on page 137. You are going to estimate the percent of each on the 10 by 10 grid. So what percent of this is shaded in? So it looks to me like I would maybe say it's approximately half because I see about half of it is blue, half of it is white. So I'm going to estimate it as 50%. You're going to look at the next one, and maybe you want to kind of like draw a line across here in half, maybe to kind of give you an idea. Okay, what part of each of those boxes are shaded? Go ahead and take a minute to do that, and then pause the video right now, and then we can check our answers. Okay, if we take a minute to look at our answers, hopefully you did a good job with your estimates. 56% for number 2. Number 3 was 92% covered. Number 4 is 37%. And down at the bottom, the try this problems, the actual answers were 36% and 40%. Moving on, we are on page 139. Okay, kind of similar what we're doing from the previous pages, but we're gonna make it a little bit more complicated. So as us in our 10 by 10 grid, we wanna shade 12 squares. So when I go ahead and I shade 12 squares, that would occupy this whole row and all of these. When I fill that in on a 10 by 10 grid, that's 100 squares. So 12 out of 100 are shaded. That makes 12%. So that gives us 12%. Okay, 12 out of 100. How can you use the shaded grid to show your answer correctly? Well, because it's out of 100, it makes it really easy for me to write my answer as a percent, 12%. Okay, if we move on, now they want us to shade 12 squares, except we're in the 5 by 5 grid. Okay, so I'm going to continue shading in till I have 12 shaded. Looks to me like that's a little bit less than a half, and I know that a half is 50%, so I can use my estimation to help me. It's asking what percent is shaded. Well, in a 5 by 5 grid, that makes 25 boxes. So I have 12 out of 25. To change that to a percent, I can do a couple different things. I can take 12 divided by 25. I get 0.48. And then to go from a decimal to a percent, if I sing A, B, C, D, E, F to P, I'm going to go from my D to my P. So I'm going to shift 2 places to the right, giving me 48%. The other option is I could make it a fraction out of 100. So if I make it a fraction out of 100, change it to a percent, this one actually goes really easily. So I can just multiply by 4 and multiply by 4. Some do not go quite so, are not so nice and neat, so I can always use cross multiplication. Okay, but 12 times 4 gives me 48. Go ahead and try the last one on your own. Pause the video, and then when you're done, you can check your answer. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to go through that problem. So when I color shaded in 12 of them, 12 out of 40, I could set it up as a proportion, and I could cross multiply and get 1200 and get 40x, and I could divide by 40, and I could get an answer of x equals 30, which 30 out of 100 is 30%. Or another way of solving it is I could divide to get a decimal, and then again, I could sing my alphabet, move that decimal over 2 places, and get 30%. Okay, if we look at the next one, the movie poster, we're splitting it into sections. 25% is a poster, 25% is the title, 40% is the photos, and 35% is the credits. So if I look and I count across here, there are 10 across, there are 20 down, 10 by 20, gives me 200. Okay, so I have 200. So we want 25%. 25% of 200. Of means to multiply, so I could change this to a fraction or a decimal, and I could multiply by it 200, so I could change it to a decimal, or I could change it to a fraction, 25 out of 100, and multiply by 200. The other option is I can set up a proportion, which is what we're going to do for a lot of these. Part to whole looks like this. So 25% is 25 out of 100. If there's a whole or a total of 200 blocks, how many out of the 200 is the same thing as 25 out of 100? This one, instead of cross multiplying, I could easily go from 100 to 200 by multiplying by 2. So I multiply by 2 and I get 50. So that would be 50 out of the 200 squares are 25%. Let's set up the next one. I have 40%. So I'll come over here. 40% is 40 out of 100. How many is that out of 200? 200 is my whole, so I have my part to whole here. Multiply by 2, multiply by 2. I get 80 out of 200. So if I were to go over here and draw some lines, here would be 50, and this would be my title. And then I could come over here and 80 more. I think I got that right. Would be my photos. And then finally, my credits would have to be the last section, which is 35% out of 100 is how I write percents. How many would that be out of 200? Multiply by 2 and double it. That would be 70 squares out of 200. Now, technically, they really just wanted us to say how many squares, so the answer would really be 50 and 80 and 70. Okay? Why don't you give number 2 a try? Pause your video, and then you can check your answers. Okay, for this problem, I can set up and count and see that there are 150 total boxes. 30 of them are the title, so I set up 30 out of 150. When I did my cross multiplication and solved, I got an answer of 20. So 20% out of 100, 20 out of 100 is 20%. When I did the photos, that one's much larger. It's 90 out of 150. I can also do this one, cross multiply, I get 9,000. Cross multiply, I get 150x. When I divide by 150, I get an answer of 60 over 100. 60 over 100 is 60%. And credits was exactly the same size as the title, so therefore I can look at that. Altogether, it should add up to the full 100%. How did we find the percent? Well, we set up proportions. Finally, to the last page, we're going to set up more part to whole proportions. Okay? 50% of a movie's budget goes towards the salaries. Their total, here's my keyword here, here's their total budget. Percents are much easier because I can write them as a fraction out of 100. And then my total is 2,400,000. Okay. I might notice that 50 out of 100 is 1/2. So I could simply take half of this and get $1,200,000 for their salaries, meaning how much they get paid, lucky ducks. Or I could also do some cross multiplication. Let's look at number 2. Henry saved $50. He spent 42% of that on downloading movies. How much did he spend on movies? So this is his part. He spent part of his money. This is his total. This is how much money he has. Part to whole, set it up. 42% is 42 out of 100. How many is that out of 50? I could cross multiply and get an answer of 21, okay? I also could write this and say 42% of $50. So I could write 42% as a decimal or a fraction. Of means times. I know how to multiply decimals, and I could certainly do it that way instead of this way and get the same exact answer. I'd like you to try number 3 and 4. So pause the video, try 3 and 4 on your own, and then look at my work. Okay, hopefully you were able to see those last two. Sometimes this kind of gets a little cut off. So if you didn't, go ahead and there's the work for numbers 1 and 2. So I apologize if that got cut off. Hopefully it didn't. If you look at 3 and 4, I set up 3 out of every 5 people who see the movie see comedies. So here's my fraction, 3 out of 5. This one, I'm simply changing it to a percent. So I can divide 3 by 5 and get 0.06 and move the decimal 2 places to get 60%. Or I could set up a proportion and again do cross multiplication. 5x equals 300. And then I divide by my 5 to get my answer. Same thing for number 4. Here's my fraction. I set it up here. We want to solve for a percent. I know that percents are out of 100. So I put x over 100. I did some cross multiplication. I got 36. So 36 out of 100 is 36%. Finally, the last one is a little different than the other ones. Marisol owns 6 movies that are comedies. This is 20% of her collections. So 6 is 20% of what number? So what they're telling us is this 6 is the part. We are solving for the total. So for part to whole, unlike the other ones, we're going to put our percent in here over 100. Before we were solving for our part. This time we know the part. It's 6. We want to know how many total she has. So 6 out of how many is 20%. So again, I'm going to do some cross multiplication. 600, 20x, 600 equals 20x. So then I'm going to divide by 20. And when I divide by 20, I get an answer of 30. So 6 out of the 30 movies in her collection are comedies.